Brian with kings. And Bill with ace-king in the straddle. Looks like he's just going to call.
So Brian opens the cutoff with kings and Bill calls in the straddle with ace-king. What does GTO say about this situation? Well, on the one hand, since there is a big blind ante in play, it means that the ranges should generally be wider compared to if there was no ante in play, because there is an incentive to expand your range both in terms of offense and defense with more dead money in the middle. However, the straddle has the opposite effect from the perspective of the raiser. With an additional person behind to get through, the straddle should cause the players to open a bit tighter compared to if there was no straddle. And finally, although it might surprise some to see that the solver agrees with just calling ace-king off instead of raising, these guys are extremely deep, and the deeper the stacks, the greater the disadvantage being out of position becomes, which means that you generally do not want to bloat the pot with combos that have a lower probability to make a huge hand, like a flush.
So you could have seen a big pot blow up pre-flop, but you see a single raise pot here. Brian's had some hands tonight.
So Brian bets 2/3 pot, and on this board the solver is splitting its range between this sizing and the smaller third pot sizing. As we mentioned in the last video, there are two primary drivers of bet size: nut advantage, which tells us the max size we can bet, and our opponent's range, which tells us how much we should actually bet up to that max. In this case, Brian has a significant nut advantage with his overpairs and the much tighter range, and Bill's range has a variety of equity profiles. On the one hand, there are many medium strength hands that he could have in this spot, like 10x and weaker pairs, as well as numerous flush and straight draws, which warrants a larger bet. But on the other hand, there's also a strong possibility that he's holding a very weak hand, like a one Broadway combo with no flush draw, which warrants a smaller bet. So this means that in theory, Brian could use either sizing with his kings to target different portions of Bill's range, though since this hand is high up his equity distribution, leaning towards the larger sizing does make sense, especially if he thinks Bill is particularly sticky, which is probably a safe assumption to make.
There's 2/3 pot here. Bill gonna continue once with the ace-king.
So in the last video, we talked about how on the river, defending decisions primarily come down to two factors: showdown value and blockers. On flops and turns, an additional factor comes into play: draw equity. From a game theory perspective, when we're deciding whether or not we should defend a marginal hand on the flop and turn, we want to prioritize combos that have both showdown value and draw equity. And when we say draw equity, we don't just mean flush and straight draws. Overcards also count as a lesser form of draw equity, since they can make strong one-pair hands. So in this case, Bill's specific combo ace-king certainly has showdown value, as it is beating all of Brian's bluffs, which are likely plentiful since he should have been c-betting at a high frequency, as we just noted. Additionally, if Bill pairs his ace or king on the turn or river, he could also pull ahead of many of Brian's value combos, including 10x and lower pairs. However, since a pair is still behind a number of Brian's stronger hands, such as sets and two pairs, very few combos with just overcards can defend. So this is somewhat of a marginal call against a 2/3 pot bet, especially without a backdoor flush draw. The turn pairs the 5 and Bill checks. Interestingly, we see that the solver actually donks out with a pretty high frequency on this card, with over 50% of its range leading out. This is a function of the principle that we spoke of in the last video, which is that the player with the nut advantage tends to play with more aggression. In this case, Bill should have a much higher proportion of 5x in his range. He defended the straddle in a single raise pot, which means that he should have most of the 5x suited combos in his range, nearly all of which should have called the flop bet. And given that Brian c-bet on the larger side, it is less likely he did so with an underpair, since larger bets tend to be more polarizing. Accordingly, this turn card boosts the top part of Bill's range and diminishes the top part of Brian's range, in particular his overpairs and 10x combos. This in turn means that Brian should be less likely to barrel on this card, which means that Bill's opportunity to check raise is decreased, and therefore if Bill was holding a strong hand, like a 5, he should have a greater incentive to seize the initiative to grow the pot himself to prevent Brian from just checking behind, which he would likely do with middling pairs.
5 on the turn. Bill could certainly have quite a bit of 5x here from the third blind, but could also just have 10x that is just never folding on this turn. Could have flush draws, straight draws, etc. Imagine Brian just continues betting here for value. Brian, 2/3 again.
So Brian barrels with another 2/3 pot bet, which the solver likes. On the flop, the solver split its range into 2 different sizes, a small bet targeting Bill's trash, and a 2/3 pot bet targeting Bill's pairs and draws. However, when Bill called the flop, much of the trash portion of that range should have folded, and when he checked the turn instead of leading, it reduced the likelihood he has a 5. So what remains in Bill's range are mostly mid-strength hands. Against that range, Brian should want to use a polarized strategy with the small size being omitted. And when we're betting a polarized range in position, unless we're at a major nut disadvantage, which is probably not the case given Bill's turn check, it usually means that we can bet all or nearly all of our strongest hands, which overpairs definitely fall within. We see that the solver bets these hands nearly 90% of the time, and betting 2/3 pot is the highest EV play for all hands in this bucket.
And Bill gonna call.
Here on the turn, Ace-King is in a similar position to the flop. It's ahead of Brian's bluffs and can potentially pull ahead of some portion, but not all of Brian's value. As such, again, Ace-King is a marginal defend that could probably go either way as a call or a fold. Bill does have better hands to call with, such as Ace-Jack of Hearts and many other flush and straight draws, so folding here would generally be fine.
Nearly 14,000 and they're going to the river. The river is another 5. And if Bill thought his ace-king high was a bluff catcher before, no need to do anything here but check. Beating the flush draws, beating the straight draws. It seems like he's got other ideas. He's going to lead. Lead for pot here.
The river puts a third 5 on the board, and this time Bill does donk out with nearly a full pot bet. And the solver does like to lead here, but it generally prefers the smaller 30% sizing, which allows the betting range to expand to include hands like pocket jacks and 10x. Similar to the turn, this is a result of the straddle having the nut advantage at the top of the range, though here on the river it is not as pronounced because in theory, Bill should have donked or raised some of his 5x on the turn. Essentially, with no other streets to come, Bill's 5x combos and pocket jacks have some incentive to place one last bet in case Brian were to check back with 10x, which the solver actually prefers to do. If instead Brian was the type to try to squeak out thin value in position with his 10x combos, then the solver would donk at a much lower frequency because the probability of having the opportunity to check raise would be increased. However, although the range as a whole is doing some donking, Ace-King is essentially a pure check. This is because Ace-King is squarely in the category of hands that we refer to as the realizing class. That is, it's the type of hand that has showdown value, but is unlikely to be ahead of villain if the pot grows bigger. Right, it's hard to think about what this bet actually accomplishes for Bill's specific hand. It's very unlikely to be called by worse, it folds out weaker, and against stronger hands, betting just increases Bill's loss. This is why it's very important from a theory perspective to not just consider what your range as a whole wants to do, but also to consider the incentives of your particular hand class. If I had to guess, Bill's bet here was simply an attempt to set the price to avoid facing a larger bet, but that incentive alone is usually not sufficient to put a hand like this into the betting category. From an EV perspective, betting generally means that you want to be called by worse, or you want to fold out better, which really doesn't apply with Bill's hand given the action up until this point.
If you're Brian, you lose to 10s and quad 5s. 4 of a kind. I would think that trip 5s would raise off the turn at some frequency. And 10s would 3-bet. Question is, can you raise for value here? I think it's a little bit thin when Bill pots it on the river after calling 2 big bets already. What are you really targeting? 10x maybe? Maybe 10x calls. It looks like Brian is going to raise here. And Brian makes it 50K here.
So to analyze this spot, since the solver was only donking with the smaller sizing, what we've done is we remove the straddle's ability to make the small bet, which causes the solver to instead fit some of its donks into the larger betting bucket that Bill actually used. An alternative way to handle this would be to node lock, which is something we discussed in the last video. However, there are a couple of caveats that we should note about node locking. One is that node locking essentially changes the rules of the game, where a player is forced to take a particular action and can never adjust, which of course is not true to real life. For example, if we node lock our opponent to under bluff, even slightly, the solver will tell us that we should dramatically overfold because it assumes that our opponent will always under bluff in that spot. But if we dramatically overfold, any decent player will recognize this and readjust by over bluffing, which node locking doesn't take into account. Additionally, when you node lock, you need to select specific combos to add or subtract, which in reality you won't know for your human opponents. And if you mess up choosing the wrong combos, or you don't balance the range properly between value and bluffs, the resulting strategy can steer you in a totally wrong direction. So my personal preference when trying to analyze a hand where a player takes an action that doesn't match the sim is to, when possible, just limit the available actions. This will then leave it up to the solver to allocate combos in a way that is EV maximizing given the parameters we've set up. And so against this bet, we see that the solver simply calls with kings and even aces, and that raising is actually a very large error. And this is a function of how Bill's large donking range is comprised. If we go back to the original sim, we see that when facing the small lead, most kings do raise because the solver's small leading range is comprised much differently. As we mentioned from a game theory perspective, a small bet allows the bettor to expand his calling range to include more middle strength hands, which in this case would have included fives full of tens and jacks. Against that range, fives full of kings are still far ahead, so raising makes sense. However, when the aggressor uses larger sizes, such as bets around pot size and over, the range becomes much more polarized, with fewer hands from the middle part of the equity distribution. So in this case, when we only give the solver the option to donk larger, it mostly does so with quads on the value side. Think about it. Brian was the pre-flop aggressor and bet relatively large on both the flop and turn, and then all of a sudden Bill leads out with a pot size bet. What is the story that Bill is telling? When Brian barreled twice, he was basically saying that at a minimum he had a strong 10, and he could also have all the jacks, queens, kings, and aces, not to mention some 5x. Against that range, it really wouldn't make sense for Bill to lead out with just a 10, and the only better hand that he possesses as the preflop caller is a 5. So with his donk, Bill is basically saying, I have way more 5x than you in this spot, and I want to put in another large bet on the last street so you can't just check back. And if the value part of Bill's range is mostly comprised of 5x, Brian raising for value with less than a 5 doesn't really make sense because you are unlikely to be called by worse. And I think this is an important lesson, particularly for those that play in the live environment. You should try to avoid feeling like you are entitled to a certain pot size simply based on the strength of your hand in a vacuum. From a theory perspective, the appropriate pot size for your hand will be based on what your opponent's range looks like and whether it contains a significant number of weaker hands that can call. Right, if you have aces and the board is 4, 5, 6, 7, 9 monotone, triple barrel shoving 100 big blinds is going to be a massive mistake unless you have a flush. Now maybe there's something about Bill's particular game that Brian is trying to exploit here, but in a vacuum, this raise is probably too thin.
Indeed, targeting a hand that Bill could have, like ace 10, queen 10, jack 10. And Bill thinking about it. Brian not much behind after the raise. Looks like Bill's reaching for chips. And look at this, Bill is going to 3-bet. This is so strong.
So since the solver was not donking with ace-king or raising with kings, to analyze this spot, we forced the straddle to check, and then we only allow the cutoff to bet the size Brian raised to. When limiting the options in this way, kings do fit within this betting bucket. Now this is obviously not a perfect solution, since a raising range will look different from a betting range, but at least this gives us a general sense of what a rational range might look like that is betting this size. And against this huge bet, not too surprisingly, the solver does very little defending in Bill's shoes, and ace-king is a pure fold. So where are the bluffs coming from then? Well, from a game theory perspective, on the river, similar to the bluff catching scenario, bluff raising comes down to showdown value and blockers. That is, we generally want to prioritize hands that have marginal showdown value such that their EV for calling is 0 or near 0, and that block villains calls and unblock villains folds. In this case, many of the cutoff bluffs are coming from ace-x, king-x, and queen-x combos, which is mainly a function of how its pre-flop range was comprised, primarily of Broadway combos. So holding both an ace and a king probably is not the ideal bluffing candidate. Instead, the solver is pulling bluffs primarily from 4x and 6x combos, which are less prevalent in the cutoff's bluff-fold range, and which block a number of the cutoff's calls, namely 5-4 and 6-5. The absolute best bluffing candidate with the highest EV for shoving is ace-4 of clubs, since this particular hand blocks both the ace-5 suited and 5-4 suited combos in the cutoff's range. And given that there are 3 5s on the board, the likelihood of Bill holding a 5 is relatively low, which also means that he shouldn't overdo it with bluffs, and needs to, in theory, prioritize hands with the absolute best bluffing qualities from the standpoint of having the highest probability of causing villain to fold. Now, if Brian folds excessively to this type of move, then Bill could expand his bluffing range, but in a vacuum, generally you want to roughly bluff in proportion to the number of value combos you have, because the more value combos you are likely to have, the more likely it is that villain will fold.
Bill is going to 3-bet all in. So he called a big bet on the flop, called a 2/3 pot size bet on the turn, donked for pot on the river. Brian raises 4x, and now Bill bet 3 bets all in. And if you're Brian, you gotta hate this spot. How is Bill ever bluffing? How is he bluffing? What a bluff from Bill.
This would be a really amazing bluff. 10 out of 10.
I think Brian's gonna fold it. I want to see what choice he has.
Probably gonna fold.
Only thing you're thinking if you are Brian here is, would Bill raise off his trip 5s on the turn on a wet board?
I fold only because I have no more money.
He does fold. And Bill shows him the bluff.
So Brian lays it down, and many in the peanut gallery with full knowledge of Bill's actual hand thought this was an easy call. However, the solver agrees with the fold. We need to keep in mind that this hand started out with an SPR of over 50, and Bill's river 3-bet was huge. If it wasn't clear by Bill's donk, it became crystal clear with his shove that Bill was saying that he had a 5. This means that all of Brian's full houses are mere bluff catchers, and given the sizing from a GTO standpoint, he only needs to bluff catch a small percentage of the time to avoid being exploitable. And putting aside GTO, how often are live players actually taking this type of line with bluffs? If we assume that this line is very value heavy, then folding all full houses makes sense, even if after the fact we come to find out that villain did actually have a bluff. Keep in mind that poker is a game of probabilities, so the question isn't whether you made the quote-unquote correct play in the single hand. It's whether on average your play is profitable over the long run. Even Phil Hellmuth throws out a bluff once every 10,000 hands, but if he isn't bluffing enough over time, then overfolding will be profitable. If, on the other hand, we think villain is capable of having sufficient bluffs here, then from a GTO perspective, as we went over in the last video, bluff catching comes down to card removal, and queens and jacks actually are better bluff catchers because these hands unblock a greater proportion of the straddle's likely bluffs, which are ace-x and king-x heavy. And if you aren't certain of what your opponent's bluffing range looks like, and you just want something to hang your hat on, knowing that you can't call all of your full houses, but want to call something to keep your opponent honest, just deciding to call with a king of clubs could make sense, since at least you would know that you're blocking king 5 of clubs, which reduces the likelihood that villain has value.
I think he just folded like 10.
No, he folded I think
Bill!
And
You had the man!
I thought Bill for sure have 10
Bill,
or
the magic!
5.
I think only have
Yesterday
What a bluff.
Good play. Oh my god.
Bill.
Bill, the magic.
That was beating hand.
That was the most ridiculous bluff I've ever seen.
Brian is stunned.
Dude, that was insane.
I'll add
We were talking
55.
about the golf on bluff, so you wanted to show us you could still do it?
Oh, right.
Still got it in me.
Rocket, no! He has to have a stop loss after that. Shit.
You're my hero, Bill.
Hand over the ring, take over the chain. Give me the fucking watch before I pop one in your brain. Stop playing these childish games with me.